It all started on an ordinary Friday evening. I had just pulled into my driveway, exhausted from a long work week, looking forward to a quiet weekend. But something was off. There were too many cars parked along my property. I wasn't expecting company, and there sure as hell shouldn't have been a full-blown traffic jam outside my place. Then I heard it, the heavy thump of bass, the high-pitched laughter, the unmistakable clinking of champagne glasses. Confused, I turned toward my barn. My barn. The one I inherited from my grandfather. The one I'd been slowly fixing up, hoping to restore it to its former glory. The one that, by every legal definition, belonged solely to me. Yet, as I approached, the scene before me looked like something out of a high-end event magazine. Fairy lights draped from the rafters, a full DJ setup blared music that was at least 2 decades past my preferred playlist, and a makeshift bar had been installed near the old tool bench, manned by a bartender who looked way too professional for a neighborhood gathering. The guests, dressed in formal attire, sipped wine, twirled around on a makeshift dance floor, and toasted to something I apparently wasn't invited to. That's when I spotted her, Margaret, the self-proclaimed queen of our neighborhood. If you've ever had the misfortune of dealing with an HOA, Margaret, you already know the type. Always involved in other people's business, always enforcing rules that don't apply to her, and always convinced that her opinion is law. Margaret ran the HOA like a dictatorship. Every minor decision had to go through her, and she had a knack for making life miserable for anyone who didn't bow to her authority. And right now, she was treating my barn like it was her personal ballroom. Ah, there he is. Margaret's voice rang out as she noticed me standing at the entrance. She beamed as if I were a special guest at an event I never agreed to host. I was wondering when you'd show up. What is this? I asked, barely keeping my voice steady. She laughed like I had just made a silly joke. Oh, don't be so dramatic. Your barn was just sitting there collecting dust. I thought it could use a little love. Doesn't it look so much better like this? She gestured around as if expecting applause. I stared at her, waiting for some kind of punchline. You did this without asking me. She waved a dismissive hand. Oh, details. Everyone loves it, and honestly, we needed a better event space for our neighborhood gatherings. It was a community decision. I glanced around. The so-called community consisted entirely of HOA members, the same people who spent the last year trying to find loopholes to control my property, despite the fact that my land was not under their jurisdiction. That's funny, I said, my voice tight, because I don't recall being part of this decision. Margaret's smile faltered just slightly. Well, technically, you weren't against it, were you? I took a deep breath. Because I didn't know it was happening. Exactly. You weren't burdened with the details, she said, giving me a patronizing pat on the arm. You're welcome, by the way. I clenched my jaw, my fists tightening at my sides. Margaret, you can't just take my barn. She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes. Oh, please. It's still your barn. We just improved it. And besides, she gestured toward the crowd. We're already in the middle of a wonderful evening. It'd be so rude to make a scene now. I glanced around again. Some of the HOA elites were watching our exchange, clearly curious about how I'd react. Others were too busy enjoying their overpriced cocktails to care. I exhaled slowly. You know what? You're right. Margaret blinked. Wait, I am. I smiled. Yeah, it'd be rude to make a scene. I looked around and gave a small nod. Enjoy your night. With that, I turned on my heel and walked away. Margaret looked momentarily surprised at how easily I backed down, but then she simply shrugged and turned back to her guests, basking in her stolen glory. She had no idea what was coming. I had a plan. If Margaret thought she could steal my barn for a party, she was about to find out what happened when you mess with the actual owner. I let the night play out, letting them get comfortable, letting them believe they'd won. Then, at exactly midnight, I made my move. Margaret was in her element. She strolled around the barn like a queen surveying her kingdom, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of expensive champagne, probably purchased with the HOA's budget. She was glowing with satisfaction, soaking in the praise from her guests as if she had just unveiled a world-class event space. And in her mind, she had. This is just spectacular, Margaret, one of the HOA board members gushed, sipping on his overpriced cocktail. I can't believe this used to be an old barn. Margaret beamed. I know. Can you believe the waste? Just sitting here, and used. But now it's a place for the community to come together. I stood off to the side, watching, listening. Every word out of her mouth was another nail in her coffin. Because what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that I wasn't upset. No, I was patient. This wasn't over. A woman in a sequin dress, one of Margaret's most loyal cronies, approached me with a smug smile. You must be so relieved that Margaret stepped in. She's done wonders with this place. Oh, absolutely, I said smoothly, forcing a polite nod. She really took initiative. The woman tittered, clearly mistaking my agreement for genuine gratitude. Exactly. And I'm sure you didn't have any big plans for this dusty old thing, right? She waved a hand dismissively at the barn. Nope, I said, taking a sip of my drink. No big plans at all. That was a lie. I had very big plans. But for now, I needed them to feel comfortable, to get just drunk enough, just relaxed enough, just oblivious enough to walk straight into their own downfall. Margaret clinked her glass with a spoon, gathering everyone's attention. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced, her voice dripping with self-importance. I just want to say how grateful I am to all of you for supporting this vision. I truly believe we're making our neighborhood better, classier, more elegant. She placed a hand on her chest dramatically. And isn't that what we all want? A chorus of murmured agreements followed, glasses lifted in toasts. Then Margaret turned toward me. And of course, she continued, we must give a big thank you to our dear neighbor, who so graciously allowed us to repurpose this space. Applause. I forced a smile. Oh, it's my pleasure, Margaret. She didn't notice the sharp edge to my tone. She was too busy basking in her own delusions. I let the night play on. More drinks were poured, more compliments were showered upon Margaret. She practically floated through the barn, eating up the admiration. At one point, she even started giving tours, like she was a real estate agent showcasing an estate she owned. And over here, she said, gesturing grandly to the toll-bench-turned bar, we completely transformed the space. It was nothing but a dusty workbench before, a waste, really. A woman gasped in mock horror. A workbench? Oh no, that's simply unacceptable. Margaret nodded solemnly. Exactly my point. Some people just don't see the potential in things. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. She truly had no idea. Then came the real kicker. Margaret, emboldened by a few too many glasses of champagne, turned to me and said, honestly, you should just let us use this for all of our future events. Think about it. No point in letting it go back to being an eyesore. My grip on my drink tightened, but my expression remained neutral. You know what, Margaret? You're right. There's no point in letting it go to waste. She beamed. Oh, I knew you'd come around. I nodded. Yep. And you know what else? Margaret cocked her head. What? I took a slow sip of my drink, letting the moment stretch just long enough. Then I smiled. Enjoy the party. She barely registered my words. She was already moving on to another group, already celebrating her supposed victory. She had no idea that every second that passed was another step closer to her downfall. Because the clock was ticking. Midnight was coming. And Margaret? She was about to lose everything. Midnight struck. The party was still going strong. Music thumping, guests laughing, drinks flowing. No one had a clue what was about to happen. I took one last look around the barn, making sure everyone was inside. Then, with a slow exhale, I stepped out, and I locked the doors. It took a few minutes before anyone noticed. The first sign of trouble came when an older gentleman in a navy suit strolled toward the exit, intending to leave. He pushed on the heavy wooden doors. They didn't budge. He frowned, tried again. Nothing. I think this door is stuck, he said, jiggling the handle harder. A woman near the front turned toward him, confused. What do you mean, stuck? I mean it's not opening. She rolled her eyes and tried it herself. Then her expression changed. Margaret, still in the middle of an animated conversation about how the barn was going to be the new HOA event space, barely noticed the murmurs of concern growing at the entrance. Then someone knocked. Boom, boom, boom. Margaret turned, eyes narrowing. What is going on? The doors won't open, someone called. She scoffed, marching toward the exit. Oh, please. You just have to. She yanked the handle hard. Nothing. Margaret frowned. Then with more force, she yanked again. The doors barely shifted. Then she realized. I could see it in her eyes, the moment it clicked. She spun around, scanning the barn for me. I was outside, standing just beyond the window, sipping my beer with the most satisfied smirk I could muster. Her face turned red. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me." She stormed to the nearest window and pounded on the glass. "Let me out right now." I took a long sip. Huh. Something wrong. Margaret's eyes narrowed into slits. "Unlock the doors." "Why?" "I thought you were enjoying your event space," I said, tilting my head. "What's the rush?" She clenched her fist. "This isn't funny." "Oh, I think it's hilarious," I said, stepping closer. "You threw a party in my barn without asking. You used my property like it was yours. So, you know what? You can keep it." All night, panic set in. A few guests started getting nervous, whispering among themselves. One woman was frantically pressing her phone screen. "There's no signal." Of course, there wasn't. I had switched off the barn's Wi-Fi earlier. Margaret had no idea. Now, the realization was settling in. They were trapped. Margaret let out a forced, breathy laugh. "Oh, come on. Don't be ridiculous. Just open the door, and we'll talk about this." "Talk," I echoed. "Like how you talked to me before throwing this party?" She scowled. "It's not the same thing." "Oh, I think it is." Her hands slapped against the window. "Listen, you don't want to make this worse. If you don't open this door right now, I swear I will." "What?" "Call the police." I grinned. "Be my guest. But I'm guessing they won't be too happy when they find out this entire party is illegal." The color drained from her face. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough for her to hear. "No permits. No permission. Trespassing." She swallowed hard. Behind her, the other HOA members started murmuring nervously. They knew I wasn't bluffing. A man in a too-tight tuxedo pointed at Margaret. "Wait, did you seriously not get permission for this?" Margaret waved him off. "Oh, please. He's being dramatic. We're just having a party in a barn." "That isn't ours," another woman cut in, a blonde near the bar. "Oh my God, are we trespassing right now?" Margaret threw up her hands. "Calm down. It's fine. He's obviously just trying to." Then, from the back, someone yelled, "Wait, where's the bathroom?" Silence. The reality hit them all at once. They were trapped inside a barn. No signal. No way out. No bathroom. I took another slow sip of my drink, watching the true panic start to unfold. Someone started banging on the doors. A man in a blazer muttered, "Oh, this is bad." A woman near the food table gasped, "I told you this was a bad idea." Margaret whipped around, hands up. "Everyone just relax. He's going to open the doors in a minute." "Aren't you?" She turned back toward me, her expression shifting to forced charm. I leaned against the window frame, considering. Then I shook my head. Nah. The panic exploded. People rushed to the doors, pushing, shoving, screaming. "This is insane. Let us out." Margaret turned back to me, eyes wild. "You can't just lock us in here." I shrugged. "Why not? You seemed fine locking me out of my own barn. I was making it better." I smirked. "And now I'm making it memorable." Someone in the crowd turned toward Margaret. "So, what's the plan here?" Margaret opened her mouth, closed it. For the first time, she had no answer. That's when the first drink spilled. A woman trying to push past a panicked man knocked over a glass of red wine. It shattered on the floor. Someone yelped, slipping on the spill. Chaos. One guy tried breaking a window, but these weren't flimsy little panes. They were reinforced barn windows, built to withstand storms. Nothing was getting them out. The night had officially turned. Margaret whirled back toward me, eyes blazing. "I swear, if you don't let us out, I will have you arrested." I smiled. "For what? Locking up my own property?" That shut her up. I pulled out my phone and raised it slightly, just enough for her to see. "Now, here's what's going to happen," I said, voice calm. "I'm going to stand right here. I'm going to enjoy my drink. And you are going to explain to all your guests why you decided to break into my property without permission." Margaret's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I definitely would." She turned back to the crowd, dozens of furious, panicked faces staring her down. I could already see it, the fear setting in, the pressure of losing control. The illusion was shattered. Margaret had trapped herself in her own mess. And I? I had all night to enjoy the show. The next morning, the entire neighborhood knew what had happened. Margaret's reputation was destroyed. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted to remove her as president. The police filed a trespassing charge, and I sent the HOA a bill for the damages, $4, $237, to be exact. Margaret's world crumbled. Her house fell into foreclosure, and she was left with nothing. Meanwhile, I turned my barn into a legitimate event space, charging the same HOA members who had once mocked me $5,000 a night to rent it. The final nail in the coffin? When Margaret, sitting on her porch, watched as the HOA board signed a contract to rent my barn for their next event. I walked past her house one afternoon and called out, "Hey, Margaret, would you like to rent the barn?" She gritted her teeth, her face turning red. "Screw you." I laughed and walked away. And that, my friends, is how you take down an HOA queen. Margaret's downfall was swift and brutal, but the fallout was far from over. The neighborhood, once tightly controlled by her iron fist, was now in chaos. The HOA board, now led by Linda, was scrambling to restore order and salvage what was left of their reputation. But as I soon discovered, power vacuums have a way of attracting new players and new problems. Linda was nothing like Margaret. Where Margaret had been brash and domineering, Linda was calculated and diplomatic. She had been one of Margaret's most loyal supporters, but her loyalty had always been conditional. When Margaret's reign crumbled, Linda was quick to seize control, positioning herself as the voice of reason in a neighborhood desperate for stability. But Linda had her own agenda. She called me a week after the barn incident, her tone polite but firm. "We need to talk," she said. "About the barn." I leaned back in my chair, already knowing where this was going. "What about it?" "We'd like to rent it for the annual HOA Gala," she said. "It's the biggest event of the year, and we need a venue that reflects the sophistication of our community." I smirked. "You mean you need a venue that isn't tainted by Margaret's little stunt?" Linda hesitated, then sighed. "Look, we both know what happened was a mistake. But we're trying to move forward. We're willing to pay your price." I raised an eyebrow. $5,000 a night. "Yes," she said, though I could hear the strain in her voice. "But we need assurances. No surprises. No locking anyone in." I laughed. "Don't worry, Linda. I'm not Margaret. I don't play games unless someone forces my hand." The deal was struck, and the HOA Gala was scheduled for the following month. But as the date approached, it became clear that not everyone was ready to move on. Margaret was down, but she wasn't out. She had spent years building her empire, and she wasn't about to let it crumble without a fight. From the shadows, she began to plot her revenge. The first sign of trouble came when I received a notice from the city. Someone had filed a complaint about my barn, claiming it violated zoning laws. The timing was suspicious, to say the least. I called Linda. "Care to explain this?" She sounded genuinely surprised. "I had nothing to do with that, but I'll look into it." A few days later, she called back. "It was Margaret," she said. "She's been making calls, pulling strings. She's trying to shut you down." I clenched my jaw. "Of course she is. But don't worry," Linda added. "We're handling it. The HOA has connections, and we'll make sure the complaint is dismissed." I wasn't convinced. Margaret was resourceful, and she had a knack for finding loopholes. If she was determined to take me down, she wouldn't stop at one complaint. The night of the HOA Gala arrived, and the barn was transformed once again. This time, however, it was on my terms. The decorations were elegant, the music was tasteful, and the guests were on their best behavior. Linda had made sure of that. But as the evening progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Margaret's absence was conspicuous, and I knew better than to think she'd let the night pass without making her presence felt. I was right. Midway through the event, the power went out. The barn was plunged into darkness, and the guests erupted into panicked murmurs. "What's going on?" someone shouted. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the breaker box. It had been tampered with, the wires cut cleanly. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage. Linda appeared at my side, her face pale. "This can't be happening." I handed her the flashlight. "Keep everyone calm. I'll handle this." I stepped outside and scanned the property. That's when I saw her, Margaret, standing at the edge of the woods, watching the chaos unfold. She met my gaze and smiled, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. The next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing with gossip. The gala had been a disaster, and fingers were pointing in every direction. Linda was furious, and the HOA board was in disarray. I called a meeting with Linda and the board. "We need to deal with Margaret," I said. "She's not going to stop until she's destroyed everything." Linda nodded. "I agree. But how? She's already filed complaints, sabotaged events. What's next?" I leaned forward. "We hit her where it hurts. Her reputation is already in shambles, but we need to make sure she can't recover. We need proof of her wrongdoing." Linda raised an eyebrow. "What kind of proof?" I smiled. "The kind that gets people arrested." Over the next few weeks, I dug into Margaret's past. It wasn't easy. She had covered her tracks well, but I eventually uncovered a trail of corruption that stretched back years. Embezzlement, bribery, even blackmail. Margaret had been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank, and she had the receipts to prove it. I presented the evidence to Linda and the board. "This is enough to put her away for years," I said. "But we need to act fast. If she catches wind of this, she'll destroy the evidence." Linda nodded. "We'll take it to the authorities. But we need to be careful. If this gets out, it could destroy the HOA." "The HOA is already on thin ice," I said. "This might be the only way to save it." The police arrived at Margaret's house the next morning. She was caught completely off guard, her face a mask of shock and fury as they cuffed her and led her away. The neighborhood watched in stunned silence as the woman who had once ruled over them with an iron fist was taken down in handcuffs. But Margaret wasn't done. As she was being loaded into the police car, she turned to me, her eyes blazing with hatred. "This isn't over," she spat. "You think you've won, but you have no idea what's coming." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Margaret was finished, and everyone knew it. With Margaret gone, the neighborhood began to heal. Linda and the HOA board worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, and my barn became a symbol of the community's resilience. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's warning had been more than just empty threats. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Margaret, written from her jail cell. "You think you've beaten me, but you're wrong. I have allies you don't even know about. And when the time is right, they'll come for you. Enjoy your victory while it lasts." I crumpled the letter and tossed it into the fire. Margaret was gone, but her shadow still loomed over the neighborhood. And as I looked out at the barn, now bustling with life and laughter, I couldn't help but wonder what was coming next. Margaret's arrest sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, but her ominous warning lingered like a dark cloud. I tried to brush it off, focusing on rebuilding my barn and maintaining my newfound status as the neighborhood's go-to event space. But deep down, I knew Margaret wasn't the type to go down without a fight. Her letter had been a clear message. The war wasn't over. For a few weeks, everything seemed peaceful. The HOA gala had been rescheduled, and this time, it went off without a hitch. Linda and the board were working hard to restore trust, and the neighborhood was slowly returning to normal. But beneath the surface, tensions were simmering. One evening, as I was closing up the barn after a private event, I noticed a car parked at the edge of my property. It was too dark to see who was inside, but I could feel their eyes on me. I ignored it, chalking it up to paranoia, but the feeling didn't go away. The next morning, I found a note taped to the barn door. It was written in the same handwriting as Margaret's letter. "You should have listened. Now it's too late." I crumpled the note and tossed it aside, but the unease stayed with me. Margaret might have been behind bars, but her influence was still very much alive. A few days later, Linda called an emergency HOA meeting. The agenda was vague, but the tension in the room was palpable. As I took my seat, I noticed a few unfamiliar faces in the crowd, people I hadn't seen at previous meetings. Linda stood at the front of the room, her expression grim. "Thank you all for coming. I'll get straight to the point. We've received some disturbing information." She paused, glancing at me before continuing. "It seems that Margaret had allies, people who were working with her behind the scenes. They've been gathering information, spreading rumors, and trying to undermine the HOA's efforts to rebuild." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. Linda held up a hand for silence. "I know this is hard to hear, but we need to address it head-on. If we don't, they'll tear this community apart." I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing. "Who are they?" Linda hesitated, then nodded to one of the unfamiliar faces, a man in a dark suit who stepped forward. "My name is Victor, and I've been investigating Margaret's network for the past few months. She had a small but dedicated group of supporters who were complicit in her schemes." They've been working to destabilize the HOA and take control. Victor handed Linda a folder, which she opened and began to read from. The names include Gregory, the former treasurer, Susan, the head of the landscaping committee, and Tom, the head of security. Gasps filled the room as the accused individuals stood, their faces a mix of shock and anger. "This is ridiculous," Gregory shouted. "You can't just accuse us like this." Linda held up the folder. "We have evidence. Emails, financial records, witness statements. It's all here." The room erupted into chaos as the accused protested their innocence, and the other members demanded answers. I sat back, watching the drama unfold. Margaret's allies had been hiding in plain sight, and now they were being exposed. As the meeting adjourned, Linda pulled me aside. "We need to talk." I followed her to her office, where Victor was waiting. "What's going on?" I asked. Linda sighed. "We've been working with Victor to uncover Margaret's network, but there's one person we haven't been able to identify, someone who's been pulling the strings from the shadows." Victor nodded. "We believe this person is the real mastermind behind Margaret's schemes. They've been using her as a pawn, and now that she's out of the picture, they're trying to take control." I frowned. "Do you have any leads?" Victor handed me a file. "We think it's someone close to you. Someone who's been watching your every move." I flipped through the file, my stomach sinking as I realized the truth. The car parked on my property, the note on the barn door. It all made sense now. "It's Evelyn," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Linda's eyes widened. "Your neighbor? The one who's always been so friendly?" I nodded. "She's been playing the long game. She's the one who's been feeding Margaret information, sabotaging the HOA, and trying to take me down." I confronted Evelyn that evening, catching her off guard as she was tending to her garden. She froze when she saw me, her smile faltering. "We need to talk," I said, my voice cold. Evelyn sighed, setting down her gardening tools. "I was wondering how long it would take you to figure it out." I crossed my arms. "Why? What do you have to gain from all this?" She smirked. "Power, of course. Margaret was a means to an end, but she got sloppy. I knew I could do better." I shook my head in disbelief. "You've been manipulating everyone, Margaret, the HOA, even me. For what? Control over a neighborhood?" Evelyn's eyes hardened. "This neighborhood is just the beginning. With the right connections, the right leverage, I could have had it all. But you ruined everything." I stepped closer, my voice low. "It's over, Evelyn. The HOA knows the truth. You're finished." She laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think this is over? You have no idea what's coming." Before I could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars pulled up to Evelyn's house, and officers stepped out, their expressions grim. "Evelyn Carter," one of them said, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and blackmail." Evelyn's smirk faded as the officers cuffed her and led her away. She shot me one last glare before disappearing into the back of a police car. With Evelyn's arrest, the neighborhood finally began to heal. The HOA board, now free from corruption, worked tirelessly to rebuild trust and restore order. My barn became a symbol of resilience, hosting events that brought the community together. Linda stepped down as HOA president, passing the torch to a new leader who promised transparency and accountability. As for me, I finally felt at peace. The battles were over, and I had come out on top. One evening, as I stood outside the barn, watching the sunset, Linda approached me. "You did it," she said. "You took down Margaret, Evelyn, and everyone else who tried to destroy this neighborhood." I smiled. "We did it. Together." She nodded, a look of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you. For everything." As she walked away, I took a deep breath, savoring the moment. The neighborhood was safe, the barn was thriving, and I had finally reclaimed what was mine. Months later, the barn hosted its most successful event yet, a community celebration to mark the end of a tumultuous chapter. The neighborhood came together, laughing, dancing, and enjoying the peace they had fought so hard to achieve. As I looked out at the crowd, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. We had faced corruption, betrayal, and chaos, but we had emerged stronger than ever. And as the music played and the night stretched on, I knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of a brighter future. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.